Long before convenience foods filled every shelf, there were simple one-pot meals that quietly carried people through hard days. These dishes were not fancy, not expensive, and often made with whatever was left in the kitchen. For many seniors living alone, these meals were more than food. They were comfort, routine, and survival. Each pot held stories of tight budgets, quiet evenings, and the determination to make something warm out of almost nothing. Today, we are revisiting 10 forgotten poor man's one-pot meals that once filled empty homes with the smell of hope, and perhaps still can again in simple ways. There was a time when even a single pot on the stove meant everything was going to be all right. One of the simplest meals that carried this quiet promise was something often called potato and onion stew. It wasn't written in cookbooks or passed down with a fancy name. It lived in memory, in habit, and in the careful hands of those who knew how to stretch almost nothing into something warm. In small kitchens, especially during the 1930s and 1940s, a few potatoes, one onion, and a bit of fat or oil were enough to begin. The potatoes were peeled slowly, never wasted, and sliced thin to cook faster. The onion, often the only source of strong flavor, was chopped and dropped into the pot first, releasing a smell that filled the entire room. That smell alone could make an empty home feel less lonely. Water was added, sometimes broth if there was any saved from before, and everything simmered gently. Salt and pepper were used carefully, never too much, because supplies had to last. As the stew thickened, the potatoes softened into a texture that felt almost creamy without any milk at all. For seniors living alone, meals like this were more than just food. They required little effort, only one pot to clean, and could last for more than one serving. But more importantly, they brought a sense of control and comfort. A quiet ritual. A reminder that even on the hardest days, something warm could still be made. This was not just a meal. It was survival, softened by time and patience. Another quiet staple that once filled empty kitchens was known simply as bean and ham bone soup. It often began after a rare, modest meal when a small piece of meat had been enjoyed, leaving behind a bone that still held flavor. Nothing was thrown away. That bone became the beginning of something new, something that could last for days. Dried beans were the heart of this meal. They were inexpensive, easy to store, and dependable. In many homes, they sat in jars on shelves, waiting for moments like this. Before cooking, they were soaked in water, sometimes overnight, softening slowly, almost like they were being brought back to life. For seniors living alone, this simple preparation became part of a familiar routine, one that filled time with quiet purpose. The ham bone was placed into a single pot, covered with water, and brought to a gentle boil. As it simmered, it released a deep, rich flavor that spread through the kitchen. The soaked beans were added, along with whatever vegetables were available, sometimes a carrot, sometimes a piece of onion, or even nothing at all. Over time, the soup thickened, the beans softened, and the broth grew stronger. It did not need much seasoning. The bone had already given everything it could. This meal was never rushed. It sat on low heat, filling the space with warmth for hours. And when it was ready, it provided more than just nourishment. It offered comfort that lasted beyond a single day, quietly reminding those who made it that even the smallest leftovers could still hold value. There was a dish that appeared in many quiet homes when cupboards were nearly bare, something often remembered as cabbage and noodle pot. It was simple, filling, and made from ingredients that could last a long time without spoiling. For seniors living alone, it became a dependable meal that asked for very little, yet gave back a sense of comfort that lingered long after the pot was empty. Cabbage was one of the most reliable vegetables to keep. It could sit for days, even weeks, without losing its usefulness. When it was finally cut open, the crisp leaves carried a mild sweetness that grew deeper with cooking. Paired with basic egg noodles or any pasta on hand, it formed the heart of this one-pot meal. The cabbage was sliced into thin strips, slowly softening in a bit of oil or fat at the bottom of the pot. As it cooked, it released a gentle aroma, not strong, but steady and familiar. The noodles were added directly into the same pot, along with water, allowing everything to cook together. This method saved effort, saved dishes, and made the process feel easier for those with limited energy. Salt and pepper were often the only seasonings, used sparingly. Sometimes, if there was a small leftover piece of meat, it might be added, but most times, it was simply cabbage and noodles, working together to create something warm. It was not a meal meant to impress. It was a meal meant to last, to fill quiet evenings, and to remind those eating it that even the simplest combinations could still bring a kind of peace to the day. In many quiet kitchens, especially during colder months, there was a humble dish often remembered as rice and tomato pot. It was built from pantry staples that almost every home tried to keep on hand. For seniors living alone, this meal offered something steady and predictable, a small comfort that could be made without much effort or expense. Rice was always dependable. It stored well, cooked easily, and stretched further than most ingredients. A single cup could turn into several servings, making it ideal for those trying to make food last. Paired with canned tomatoes, which were often preserved during better seasons, it created a dish that felt both simple and complete. The pot would begin with a bit of oil or leftover fat, warmed gently before the rice was added. The grains were stirred slowly, sometimes until they gave off a faint nutty scent. Then the tomatoes were poured in, along with water, turning everything into a soft, simmering mixture. The color alone brought a kind of warmth to the room. As it cooked, the rice absorbed the liquid, becoming tender and slightly rich from the tomatoes. Salt and pepper were added carefully, never wasted. Occasionally, a pinch of dried herbs might be used if available, but often it was left plain. For someone living alone, this dish meant more than just a meal. It required little attention, only one pot, and provided enough for another day. In its quiet simplicity, it offered a reminder that even the most basic ingredients could come together to create something steady, filling, and quietly reassuring. There was a time when even stale bread was never truly wasted. In many small homes, it became the base of a quiet, filling dish often remembered as bread and milk pot. It may sound simple, even plain, but for seniors living alone, it was a gentle, comforting meal that required almost no effort and made use of what others might have thrown away. Bread, especially when it had grown hard with time, was still valuable. Instead of discarding it, slices were broken into pieces and placed into a single pot. Milk was poured over slowly, sometimes diluted with a bit of water to make it stretch further. As the pot warmed, the bread began to soften, slowly absorbing the liquid and turning into something smooth and easy to eat. This was a meal that asked for patience rather than skill. It simmered quietly, filling the room with a mild, familiar scent. A small pinch of salt might be added, or occasionally a bit of sugar if something slightly sweeter was desired. In some homes, a touch of butter was stirred in at the end, if there was any to spare. For those with limited energy or difficulty chewing, this dish offered comfort in its texture alone. It was soft, warm, and easy, requiring little strength to prepare or enjoy. But beyond that, it carried a deeper meaning. It was a reminder that nothing had to be wasted, that even the simplest ingredients could still provide warmth, nourishment, and a quiet sense of care in otherwise silent evenings. In many modest homes, there was a meal that came together quietly with almost no planning at all, often remembered as cornmeal mush pot. It was one of the most affordable dishes a person could make, relying on a single ingredient that was always kept nearby. For seniors living alone, it became a steady, reliable comfort that required little strength, little time, and almost no expense. Cornmeal was a staple in many kitchens. It could sit on a shelf for long periods, waiting patiently until it was needed. When the time came, water was brought to a gentle boil in a single pot, and the cornmeal was slowly stirred in. This step was done carefully, because if rushed, the mixture could clump. But with patience, it transformed into a smooth, thick consistency. As it cooked, the mush began to take on a soft, creamy texture. It did not need much seasoning. A small pinch of salt was often enough. In some cases, if there was a bit of milk or butter available, it might be added for extra richness, but many times it was eaten just as it was. For those living alone, this meal offered more than simplicity. It was easy to prepare, gentle to eat, and could be made in small or large amounts depending on need. It also carried a quiet familiarity, something that had been made the same way for generations. It was not exciting or elaborate, but it did what it needed to do. It filled the stomach, warmed the body, and reminded those who made it that even the simplest traditions could still bring a sense of steadiness to the day. There was a dish that came together on the coldest evenings, when energy was low and the day felt longer than it should have. It was often remembered as lentil and garlic pot, a quiet, nourishing meal that relied on ingredients known for their strength and simplicity. For seniors living alone, it offered something steady, something that could be made without much effort yet still feel complete. Lentils were one of the most dependable staples to keep. They required no soaking, cooked faster than most dried foods, and provided a sense of fullness that lasted. In many homes, a small jar of lentils was always within reach, ready to be turned into something warm at a moment's notice. The pot would begin with a bit of oil, gently heated before adding crushed garlic. As it softened, the garlic released a rich, comforting aroma that filled the space, making the room feel less empty. The lentils were then added, along with water, and left to simmer slowly. As the minutes passed, the lentils softened and the broth thickened naturally. Salt was used sparingly, sometimes with a touch of pepper if available. There was no need for much else. The ingredients carried their own quiet strength. For someone living alone, this meal was both practical and reassuring. It required only one pot, very little attention, and created enough to last beyond a single serving. But more than that, it brought a feeling of warmth that lingered. It was not just about eating. It was about creating something steady, something dependable, in a quiet home where even a simple pot on the stove could bring comfort. There was a meal that often appeared when very little remained in the kitchen, something quietly known as egg drop broth pot. It was simple, quick, and built from the most basic ingredients, yet it carried a surprising sense of warmth. For seniors living alone, it became a reliable choice on days when energy was low but something hot was still needed. Eggs were one of the few ingredients that could turn almost nothing into a meal. They were affordable, easy to keep, and full of nourishment. In this dish, water or leftover broth was brought to a gentle simmer in a single pot. If there was a small piece of onion or a pinch of seasoning, it might be added, but often the liquid remained plain. Once the pot was ready, an egg was cracked into a bowl and stirred lightly. Then, slowly, it was poured into the simmering liquid. As it touched the heat, it formed soft ribbons that drifted through the broth. The transformation was simple but comforting to watch, as something so small became part of the whole. A pinch of salt was usually enough to finish it. Sometimes, a bit of pepper was added for warmth, but many times it was left just as it was. For those living alone, this meal offered ease above all else. It came together quickly, required little cleanup, and provided gentle nourishment. But beyond that, it brought a quiet reassurance, a reminder that even with very little, something warm and sustaining could still be made in moments of need. In quiet kitchens where cupboards were nearly empty, there was a dish known simply as vegetable and rice pot. It was the kind of meal born out of necessity, yet it carried a quiet comfort that lingered long after the last bite. For seniors living alone, it became a dependable, low-effort solution when energy was scarce, but hunger still demanded attention. The beauty of this dish lay in its simplicity. Any leftover vegetables could be used: carrots, peas, cabbage, or even a bit of frozen corn. Rice was the base, cheap and filling, able to stretch a small meal into several portions. The pot began with a small amount of oil or fat, enough to soften the vegetables slightly before the rice was added. Water or broth, if available, was poured over, covering the ingredients. Then, everything was stirred slowly and left to simmer. The rice absorbed the liquid, the vegetables softened, and the flavors blended in a quiet harmony. Salt and pepper were used sparingly, as each pinch counted in a household trying to make resources last. This one-pot meal required very little attention. Occasionally, the pot was stirred, but mostly it was left to cook on low heat. The aroma filled the room, not overpowering, but enough to make an empty kitchen feel warm and alive. For seniors living alone, the value of this meal went beyond nourishment. It required minimal effort, cleaned up quickly, and often provided enough for more than one meal. Yet, it also carried a subtle emotional weight, a reminder of past routines, quiet evenings, and the resilience of making do with what was available. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't elaborate, but it was steady, reliable, and quietly comforting, a true reflection of meals made with patience, care, and simplicity. One of the quietest yet most satisfying meals for seniors living alone was often called oatmeal and fruit pot. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, but it had a way of filling an empty kitchen with warmth and familiarity. For those who remembered simpler times, it was more than breakfast. It was comfort, routine, and sustenance wrapped in one humble pot. Rolled oats or any basic oatmeal served as the base. They were inexpensive, easy to store, and cooked quickly. In a single pot, water or milk was brought to a gentle boil, and the oats were added slowly, stirred to prevent clumping. Even without additional ingredients, the oats alone absorbed the liquid and thickened into a smooth, creamy texture. If there was a small portion of fruit, apple slices, berries, or even canned peaches, it was added during cooking. This not only introduced flavor but also natural sweetness, making the dish feel more complete. A pinch of salt, sometimes a dash of cinnamon or sugar, rounded out the flavor without overwhelming it. What made this dish especially practical for seniors living alone was its simplicity. Only one pot was needed, cleanup was minimal, and it could be eaten immediately or kept warm for later. It provided nourishment, warmth, and a sense of quiet accomplishment, knowing that even a small effort could result in a complete, satisfying meal. Beyond its practicality, the oatmeal and fruit pot carried emotional weight. It reminded those who ate it of mornings long past, of kitchens filled with gentle smells, and of the comfort found in routine. In a world that could feel lonely or overwhelming, this simple dish was a reminder that care, patience, and thoughtfulness could turn even the most basic ingredients into something meaningful. It wasn't just food. It was warmth, sustenance, and quiet companionship, all from a single humble pot. These forgotten one-pot meals weren't just recipes, they were lifelines for seniors living alone, simple ways to nourish the body and soothe the soul. Each dish carried history, resourcefulness, and quiet comfort, showing that even the humblest ingredients could create warmth and meaning. Revisiting these meals reminds us how creativity and care shaped daily life, long before convenience ruled the kitchen. If you've enjoyed uncovering these lost recipes and the stories behind them, subscribe and join our journey through America's culinary past, where every forgotten dish tells a story worth remembering and sharing with the next generation.